Before big institutions, before movements, before headlines and monuments, America was shaped by individuals. Solitary minds, stubborn spirits, men and women who stood alone when no one else would. They weren't generals. They weren't presidents. They weren't the names you hear in school textbooks. They were ordinary people with extraordinary resolve. And it was often their refusal to blend in that changed the nation forever. This is the story of the unknown American heroes. The thinkers, the inventors, the rebels of conscience, the protectors of nature, the pioneers of science, the souls who changed history, not by following the crowd, but by walking alone. Every era of American history has such a figure. A person who looks at the world and sees something no one else sees. A world where disease can be defeated, equality is possible, imagination fuels innovation, the environment deserves a guardian, a single voice can shift public opinion, one invention can transform civilization. Some of these people worked in laboratories lit by a single lamp. Others walked forests untouched by roads. Some stood alone in front of a hostile society. Some simply refused to accept that's how things are. They had no armies, no political machines, no power behind them. Just resolve. And that was enough. This documentary begins with a simple truth. American history is full of people who changed the nation without permission. Jonas Salk didn't wait for approval when he devoted himself to ending polio. Grace Hopper didn't ask if she was allowed to reimagine computer science. Rachel Carson didn't stay silent when she saw the environment collapsing. George Washington Carver didn't stop when society told him to. Nikola Tesla, working from cramped workshops and rented rooms, reshaped the future of electricity. John Muir walked into the wilderness alone and came back with the idea that would build the national parks. Harriet Tubman stood against an entire system and pulled people out of darkness, one life at a time. Different centuries, different battles, same courage. What makes their stories so powerful isn't just the outcome, but the beginning. Because each of them started with nothing but an idea, a belief, an obsession, or a moral clarity that refused to bend. No political influence, no institutional backing, often no support at all. Some were ignored, some were dismissed, some were ridiculed, some were warned to stop. But they didn't. And the nation that exists today, the science we use, the rights we defend, the landscapes we preserve, was shaped by their refusal to disappear. In this series of 10 parts, we will travel across a century and a half of American history to uncover these extraordinary figures. Not the famous ones, the foundational ones, the voices who weren't loud, but were impossible to silence. Every part of this documentary will bring us closer to their worlds. The forests of 19th century California, the segregated classrooms of the Jim Crow South, the primitive laboratories of early computing, the frontier skies flown by pioneering aviators, the farms transformed by environmental innovation, the quiet rooms where vaccines were born. And throughout this journey, one pattern will become clear. America was not built by the powerful. It was repaired, reinvented, and redeemed by the solitary. And now, we begin our journey with one of the most visionary scientists the world has ever seen. A man who fought not for glory or wealth, but for humanity itself. Our journey begins in the early 1950s, in a small, dimly lit laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh. A place where a quiet scientist worked long nights while the world outside lived in fear. Polio wasn't just a disease back then. It was a nightmare. Every summer, parents kept their children indoors, swimming pools closed, playgrounds emptied, entire towns held their breath. In 1952 alone, Polio paralyzed more than 21,000 Americans. Hospitals were filled with iron lungs, huge mechanical cylinders that breathed for children who no longer could. Doctors searched, governments worried, but there was one man who believed that a solution existed even when most of his colleagues said it couldn't be done so quickly. His name was Jonas Salk. Salk wasn't a celebrity scientist. He wasn't backed by enormous laboratories or powerful institutions. He was the son of immigrants, a calm, methodical man who preferred silence to attention. And he had a radical idea. A vaccine that didn't weaken the virus, but killed it completely. Many experts dismissed the concept. They said it was too ambitious, too risky, too unconventional. But Salk didn't argue. He simply worked. Night after night, his team tested viral strains, observed reactions, improved formulas. A small group of researchers, often overlooked, fighting an invisible enemy that terrified an entire nation. In 1953, after thousands of trials, Salk believed he had found the answer. But he wasn't ready to celebrate. Not yet. He insisted on one final test, a test on himself, and on his wife, and on his children. Because if he didn't trust his own work with his own life, how could he ask America to trust him? When the field trials began in 1954, they were the largest medical experiment in human history. 1.8 million children participated. They were called the polio pioneers. Doctors, nurses, teachers, volunteers, the entire country mobilized. And on April 12, 1955, the results were announced. The vaccine worked. It was safe. It was effective. It could stop the epidemic. The news swept across the nation like a wave of relief. For the first time in years, parents cried tears of hope instead of fear. Polio cases plunged almost immediately. And Jonas Salk became a hero overnight. But what he did next is what truly made him a legend. Weeks after the announcement, a journalist asked Salk the most important question of his career. Who owns the patent? Salk paused for a second and answered, "There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" He refused to make money from the vaccine, refused to profit from saving lives, refused to claim ownership of something he believed belonged to humanity. Because for him, the victory wasn't scientific, it was moral. Within a decade, polio was virtually eliminated from the United States. Millions of children were spared paralysis. Thousands of families were spared tragedy. And all because one man, quiet, determined, unshakable, chose to stand alone against a disease the world feared. Jonas Salk changed history without armies, without political power, without wealth or fame. He changed it with conviction, with discipline, with compassion. And he opened the door to a new America, one in which science became a shield and a single mind could protect an entire nation. In the next part, we follow another solitary figure, a woman who didn't fight a virus, but fought silence itself, and changed the way the world sees the environment. Her name was Rachel Carson, and her story is as courageous as Salk's. If Jonas Salk saved lives by conquering a virus, Rachel Carson saved lives by conquering a silence so deep and so dangerous that entire ecosystems were collapsing while no one dared to speak. The United States in the 1950s looked unstoppable. Industries were booming, technology was exploding, chemical companies were transforming agriculture with new, miracle substances. One of those substances was DDT, a pesticide sprayed on crops, forests, rivers, lakes, towns, and sometimes directly on children during summer mosquito campaigns. It was advertised as harmless. It was celebrated as progress. It was considered the symbol of a modern, scientific America. Except one woman looked closer and saw something the rest of the country refused to see. Rachel Carson was not a politician, not a corporate scientist, not an activist with a team. She was a solitary writer, a marine biologist with a gentle voice and a quiet life near the coast of Maryland. But she had two things that would soon shake the nation: a deep knowledge of nature and the courage to reveal its wounds. Carson began collecting stories in the late 1950s. Birds dying in suburban yards, fish disappearing from rivers, bees collapsing after crop sprays, farms turning silent, entire forests affected by chemical drift. What she found was undeniable. The chemicals meant to protect life were silently destroying it, and almost no one wanted to hear it. Chemical companies dismissed her concerns. Scientists warned her to be careful, publishers feared lawsuits, officials insisted everything was safe. But Rachel Carson, working alone, without institutional backing, kept going. She gathered research, interviewed farmers, studied toxicology, consulted unpublished reports, connected patterns others had ignored. Every page brought her closer to a truth that would change America. In 1962, after 4 years of writing and resisting pressure, she published a book that shook the world: Silent Spring. The book's opening chapter was unforgettable, a description of a town where birds had vanished, where spring arrived without songs, where the natural world had been silenced. It wasn't fantasy, it was a warning. Rachel Carson exposed how pesticides accumulated in soil, veins, water, milk, food, and human organs. She showed that these chemicals did not disappear after spraying. They stayed, spread, multiplied, and entered the food chain. The reaction was immediate, explosive, historic. Chemical companies launched public attacks on her credibility. They called her hysterical, unqualified, anti-progress. But the public, for the first time, started to ask questions. Why were birds dying? Why were rivers changing? What was happening to the land? Carson had opened the door. The U.S. Senate called her to testify. She spoke softly, slowly, precisely. But her words carried the weight of an entire collapsing ecosystem. Her message was simple. Humans are part of nature. What we poison, we eventually receive back. That idea, obvious today, was revolutionary back then, and it changed everything. In the years that followed, DDT was heavily restricted, new environmental laws were drafted, public awareness grew, ecological science advanced, young activists found their voice, journalists began investigating pollution. The first large-scale environmental movement was born. And in 1970, 8 years after Silent Spring, the United States created the Environmental Protection Agency, one of the most important institutions of modern America. All because one woman refused to stay silent when the world around her was losing its voice. Rachel Carson worked alone. She fought alone. She stood against corporations alone. And yet, because of her, rivers run cleaner, species survived, ecosystems recovered, and generations grew up aware that protecting the earth is not a luxury. It is survival. In the next part, our journey continues with another solitary mind, a man who entered the wilderness with nothing but a backpack and returned with an idea that would change America forever. His name was John Muir, and he was the reason the U.S. still has wild nature left to protect. If Rachel Carson protected the future, John Muir protected something even more fragile, the soul of America's wilderness, a soul that, in the late 19th century, was disappearing faster than anyone realized. Back then, the American frontier felt infinite. Forests stretched for thousands of miles. Waterfalls thundered in untouched valleys. Glaciers shined under open skies no one had ever mapped. But industry had begun its march, mines digging deeper, sawmills swallowing forests, railroads carving through mountains. To the nation, it was progress. To one Scottish-born wanderer with a worn backpack and notebooks full of poetic sketches, it was a warning. That man was John Muir. Muir didn't arrive in America with a plan. He wasn't a politician, not a wealthy landowner, not a trained scientist. He was a dreamer with a love for solitude, a man who trusted mountains more than crowds. After losing sight in one eye due to a factory accident, Muir decided to leave industrial life behind and simply walk, across the untouched regions of the American West. And what he found was beauty so overwhelming that he felt almost obligated to defend it. Yosemite, the Sierra Nevada, sequoia forests older than civilizations, valleys carved by ancient glaciers, lakes so pure they mirrored the sky perfectly. Muir recorded everything: sketches, diaries, scientific notes, essays describing nature as a living being with a right to exist independently of humans. It was a philosophy unheard of in his time. But Muir wasn't content with admiration. He believed wilderness had a purpose far beyond beauty. It restored the human spirit. It nourished the national identity. It protected biodiversity long before that word existed. So he took a step no one expected. He wrote, he lectured, he spoke with the passion of a preacher and the precision of a geologist. And slowly, Americans began to listen. His essays reached the White House. His letters influenced newspapers nationwide. His words captured the hearts of city dwellers who had never seen a mountain in their lives. He convinced them that nature was not endless, and if they wanted their children to see it, someone had to fight for it. That someone was him. In 1890, because of John Muir's relentless writing and activism, the United States did something unprecedented. It created Yosemite National Park, not a private reserve, not a state property, a federally protected sanctuary for future generations. This single act changed the entire trajectory of American conservation. But Muir wasn't finished. He co-founded the Sierra Club, now one of the most influential environmental organizations in the world. He campaigned for the protection of Sequoia, Mount Rainier, Grand Canyon, and countless other landscapes. He hiked thousands of miles alone. He slept under stars the world would one day recognize thanks to his battle. He wrote pages that would inspire presidents, scientists, and ordinary families to demand protected lands from coast to coast. By the time John Muir died in 1914, America had embraced a radical idea. Nature is not a resource, it is a heritage. And that heritage exists today because one man, with no office, no funding, no authority, chose to defend mountains with nothing but his voice and determination. Millions of acres of national parks, millions of annual visitors, millions of lives touched by the wilderness. All of it traces back to a solitary wanderer who believed the earth deserved guardianship. In the next part, our journey shifts from forests to imagination, to a brilliant mind whose inventions reshaped the modern world. A man born under storms, guided by visions, and powered by an intensity no one around him could understand. His name was Nikola Tesla, and though the world knows him today, he lived most of his life alone, fighting for ideas that society wasn't ready to believe. Some heroes save forests, some save lives, but a few, a very rare few, changed the future itself. Among America's greatest solitary minds, no figure stands more mysterious, more brilliant, or more misunderstood than Nikola Tesla. A man who walked through thunderstorms as a child because he believed the lightning spoke to him. A man who saw inventions in his mind as bright and complete as photographs. A man who arrived in the United States in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket and the most ambitious dreams the world had ever seen. Tesla was not just an inventor. He was a one-man civilization, and almost all of his work was done alone. When Tesla reached America, the world lived on direct current, DC electricity, a system inefficient, expensive, and limited. But Tesla envisioned something else, alternating current, AC, a form of electricity that could travel long distances, power cities, and reach every home in the country. The problem? Almost no one believed him. His ideas seemed too radical, too mathematical, too ahead of their time. Even Thomas Edison dismissed him. But Tesla, solitary and unshakable, built his own motors, his own generators, his own experiments in cramped workshops, lit only by the glow of his own inventions. Piece by piece, he constructed the future. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Tesla's AC system illuminated the entire fair, the first all-electric World's Exposition. Millions watched in awe as the night lit up like a second sunrise. Weeks earlier, Edison's direct current system had failed to win the contract. Tesla's victory wasn't just scientific, it was symbolic. From that day onward, America transformed into a nation powered by AC electricity, the same system the world uses today. One man, one idea, a revolution. But Tesla wasn't done. He dreamed of wireless communication, wireless energy, remote-controlled machines, global transmission towers, drones before drones existed, radar decades before it was invented, renewable energy, earthquake-resistant buildings, a world interconnected by invisible forces. He built prototypes in quiet labs. He experimented in deserts, mountains, and hotel rooms. He patented devices that no one understood for decades. He demonstrated the first radio-controlled robot in 1898, a small boat, controlled not by wires, but by invisible waves. People thought it was magic. Tesla smiled. For him, it was simple physics. As his visions grew larger, the world grew smaller around him. Investors wanted profit, not dreams. Companies wanted certainty, not imagination. Tesla refused to compromise. He refused to simplify. He refused to limit his ideas to what the world wanted. And so, like many solitary geniuses, he drifted from spotlight to shadow. He lived his final years in a small New York hotel room, feeding pigeons, conducting mental experiments, writing notes filled with sketches of machines no one alive had ever seen. When he died in 1943, the world barely noticed. But the world he invented had already begun. Today, Tesla's fingerprints are everywhere. Every home using AC electricity, every wireless device, every remote control, every drone, every radar system, every electric motor, every modern power grid. His name stands on billions of machines. His ideas fuel entire industries. His patents shape the modern era. And he achieved all of this with almost no support, no institutional backing, and no guaranteed success. Tesla's story is the ultimate example of how one solitary mind can outrun an entire century and pull the rest of humanity forward. In the next part, our journey shifts from electricity to the frontier of the impossible, the story of a woman who broke the sky itself. A lone pilot with a fearless heart who challenged the limits of early aviation and vanished into legend. Her name was Amelia Earhart, and her courage still echoes across the world. Some heroes fight disease, some protect forests, some invent the future. But a rare kind of hero chooses a battlefield far more dangerous: the open sky, where courage has no place to hide and failure is final. Among the most iconic solitary figures in American history stands a woman whose name is known everywhere, but whose true story, the fearlessness, the discipline, the isolation, is often misunderstood. Her name was Amelia Earhart, and she flew not for fame, not for politics, but for possibility. In the 1920s, aviation was still a young beast, loud, unstable, unpredictable. Engines failed without warning. Wings shook in violent winds. Navigation was a mixture of instinct, mathematics, and pure nerve. It was a world dominated entirely by men, a world where women were told they were too fragile, too emotional, too weak to handle flight. Amelia Earhart ignored all of that. Born in Kansas, raised on stories of adventure, she felt drawn to the sky from the first moment she saw an airplane. It wasn't beauty that attracted her. It was the challenge. Flying was dangerous. Flying was impossible. Flying was exactly what she wanted. Her path to the cockpit was not glamorous. She worked odd jobs. She studied whenever she could. She saved every dollar until she could afford lessons. Her first instructor wrote, "She had something no other student had, a quiet, relentless determination." When Earhart finally flew solo, she didn't smile. She simply said, "Now I know what I was born to do." And she did it with the discipline of a soldier and the heart of a poet. Amelia Earhart didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to push boundaries, and she did. In 1928, she became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger. But she hated that word, passenger. She wanted control, responsibility, mastery. So in 1932, she did something almost unthinkable. She flew across the Atlantic alone. No co-pilot, no navigator, no backup. Just her, a single-engine plane, and an ocean filled with storms. She battled freezing winds, a leaking fuel tank, ice on the wings, and a cockpit shaking hard enough to tear skin from metal. When she landed in Ireland, exhausted and half-frozen, a farmer walked up to her and said, "Have you come far?" Earhart replied, "From America." That moment changed history. The world saw a woman who had done the impossible. But Earhart didn't see a woman. She saw a pilot. And she had more to do. Throughout the 1930s, she set record after record. First woman to fly solo from Hawaii to California. First woman to fly solo coast to coast. World altitude records, distance records, speed records. But Amelia Earhart wasn't chasing personal achievement. She believed deeply in one mission, to show young women everywhere that they were capable of anything. Her flights were letters addressed to the future. And every time she took off, she didn't rise alone. She pulled millions upward with her. In 1937, she attempted her greatest challenge, a flight around the world. A journey so dangerous that even the best pilots hesitated. But not Earhart. She and navigator Fred Noonan set off in a Lockheed Electra, a silver bird designed to push the limits of endurance. They crossed continents, oceans, mountains, and equatorial storms. And then, somewhere over the Pacific, radio contact faded. A final transmission, then silence. The world searched. The oceans searched. But Amelia Earhart was never found. Her disappearance became a legend. Her legacy became a beacon. What made her an American hero was not the mystery of her final flight, but the courage of every flight before it. She did not conquer the sky. She respected it, challenged it, pushed herself against it, with discipline, humility, and defiant hope. Amelia Earhart stood alone in an era that offered her no easy path. But by walking alone, she opened runways for millions. In the next part, we follow another quiet titan, a man who revolutionized American agriculture and fed a nation with nothing but curiosity and compassion. His name was George Washington Carver, and his story is one of the most remarkable transformations in U.S. scientific history. Some heroes fight in laboratories, some fight in the sky, but some fight in the soil, with nothing but intelligence, patience, and an understanding of the earth so deep that it borders on poetry. Among America's greatest solitary innovators stands George Washington Carver, a man who rose from the harshest circumstances imaginable and changed the way an entire nation fed itself. His story begins not in a university, not in a laboratory, but in a broken cabin on a farm in Missouri, where Carver was born into slavery around 1864. When he was still a baby, he, his sister, and his mother were kidnapped by raiders and disappeared into the chaos of the era. Only George was eventually recovered, sick, fragile, and orphaned. He grew up with no wealth, no privilege, no access to education, but he had one gift that nothing could erase: curiosity. As a child, Carver wandered the woods alone, studying plants, insects, moss, soil. Neighbors called him the plant doctor. He healed sick plants the way other children fixed toys. He asked questions no one had the patience to answer. Why does this soil dry out? Why do some crops fail? Why do some plants thrive without help? Carver taught himself to read. He walked miles to attend school. He was rejected from colleges because of his race. He kept walking, kept applying, kept learning. Finally, he was accepted at Iowa State College, where professors quickly realized they were not teaching him, they were witnessing him. His genius was quiet, but unmistakable. When Booker T. Washington invited Carver to join Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, Carver accepted, not for fame, not for money, but because he had a mission to help the poorest farmers in the American South escape the cycle of poverty. Back then, cotton was everything, and cotton was destroying the land. Soils were exhausted, yields were collapsing, families were starving. Carver arrived with a revolutionary idea: plant peanuts, plant sweet potatoes, give the soil time to breathe again. Farmers laughed at first, then they tried it, and the land began to heal. Cotton returned stronger than before. Families had new foods to eat. Farmers discovered they could survive droughts, pests, and bad seasons. Carver had solved a problem that had crippled the South for decades. But then another problem emerged. If farmers planted peanuts and sweet potatoes, what would they do with all of them? Carver solved that too. Working almost entirely alone in a simple laboratory filled with beakers, soil samples, and hand-built equipment, he invented over 300 peanut-based products, over 100 sweet potato products, new dyes, oils, paints, plant-based plastics, flowers, soaps, medicinal balms, even a rubber substitute. He didn't patent most of them. He didn't want to get rich. He wanted people to use the ideas freely. Carver turned humble crops into tools of economic survival. He turned science into empowerment. In 1921, George Washington Carver was invited to speak before the U.S. Congress. Lawmakers expected a long technical lecture. Instead, Carver walked to the podium, held up a few peanuts, and spoke with such clarity and passion that the room fell silent. He explained crop rotation, soil balance, and agricultural sustainability in plain, elegant language. When he finished, the committee chair said, "Dr. Carver, you astonish me." Carver replied simply, "I only ask the plants what they are good for, and they tell me." It was one of the greatest testimonies in the history of American science. By the time he died in 1943, Carver had transformed the landscape of Southern agriculture. He had lifted thousands of families out of poverty. He had restored millions of acres of soil. He had proven that innovation does not require wealth, only curiosity, patience, and purpose. George Washington Carver began life as a child with nothing. He ended life as one of the most respected scientists in America. Not because he sought fame, but because he sought solutions. Not because he built machines, but because he built hope. In the next part, we follow another mind who reshaped modern life. A woman whose mathematical brilliance laid the foundation of computer science itself. Her name was Grace Hopper. and she rewrote the world using nothing but logic and imagination. Some heroes save forests, some save the sick, some lift entire communities, but some reshape the invisible architecture of modern life, lines of logic, sequences of code, the quiet mathematics that now runs the entire world. Among America's most influential solitary thinkers stands Grace Hopper, a naval officer and computer scientist, who single-handedly cracked open the rigid alien language of early computers and taught machines how to speak to humans. Her work didn't just change technology, it changed the way civilization functions. And, like every hero in this documentary, she did it mostly alone. Born in New York in 1906, Grace Hopper grew up taking clocks apart, not to break them, but to understand their secrets. She became one of the few women of her generation to earn a PhD in mathematics. Then she joined the U.S. Navy during World War II, where she was assigned to work on something new, experimental, almost mystical at the time, a computer. Not the sleek devices we know today, but a machine that filled an entire room, buzzed like an angry hive, and responded only to complex numerical commands. Most people saw a machine. Grace Hopper saw a challenge. When she began working on the legendary Harvard Mark I computer, Hopper quickly realized something. The greatest barrier to computing was not hardware, but language. Early computers understood only raw machine code, cryptic sequences of numbers unreadable to anyone except a handful of specialists. It was slow. It was limiting. It was a cage around innovation. Grace Hopper had a revolutionary idea. What if computers could understand words? Her colleagues told her it was impossible, ridiculous, a waste of time. One of them even said, "Computers do math. They will never process English." But Hopper, stubborn and brilliant, refused to accept that. She began working alone in quiet offices, late at night, writing notes on yellow pads, testing prototypes on machines that looked ready to shake themselves apart. Her goal was simple and revolutionary: create a programming language so intuitive that ordinary people could use computers. In the 1950s, she achieved what everyone else said could not be done. She created the first compiler, a program that translates human-readable instructions into machine code automatically. It was the birth of modern programming. Instead of typing endless lines of numbers, engineers could now write commands like print, call, if move. The idea changed everything. Her colleagues were stunned. Industry leaders were cautious. But Hopper knew she had opened a door that would never close again. Her next breakthrough was even bigger. Grace Hopper led the development of COBOL, the first major programming language designed for business, finance, and government. COBOL allowed the United States to automate banking, to modernize industry, to build early networks, to transform communication and logistics. For decades, COBOL quietly ran. Payroll systems, airport scheduling, military logistics, hospital records, banking databases, tax systems, early corporate computing. Millions of Americans use services powered by COBOL without ever hearing its name. And all of it began with one woman who believed computers should serve people, not confuse them. Grace Hopper didn't chase fame. She didn't chase money. She chased clarity. She explained computing with metaphors, jokes, stories. She carried around a nanosecond, a piece of wire exactly 1 foot long to show how far electricity travels in a billionth of a second. She inspired generations of young programmers, young officers, young scientists. By the time she retired from the Navy as a rear admiral, she had become not only a pioneer, but the spiritual architect of modern programming. Her legacy? Everything we use today. Every app, every website, every digital service, every corporate system, every automated process. All of it stands on the foundation she built with logic, imagination, and the determination to do what others dismissed as impossible. In the next part of this documentary, we turn to another hero, a photographer armed with nothing but a camera, who captured the suffering of millions and forced America to face a truth it had ignored for too long. Her name was Dorothea Lange, and the images she created in solitude changed a nation's conscience. Most heroes speak, some invent, some fight. But a rare kind of hero changes the world without raising a voice, using only the quietest instrument of truth, a camera. Among America's greatest solitary witnesses stands Dorothea Lange, a woman whose photographs didn't just document history, they reshaped the nation's conscience. Her story begins long before the Great Depression, long before she became famous, long before her images moved presidents to action. It begins with a girl who learned to observe everything. Dorothea Lange grew up in New York City, the daughter of a modest family, introverted, thoughtful, and marked by two life-changing events. She contracted polio at age 7, which left her with a lifelong limp, and her father abandoned the family when she was still a child. Pain shaped her, not with bitterness, but with empathy. She walked slower than others, so she watched more. She noticed details no one else paused to see. Her eyes became her strength. By the time she discovered photography, it wasn't a profession for her. It was a destiny. In the 1920s, Lange opened a portrait studio in San Francisco. She photographed wealthy families, businessmen, society ladies. But something in her felt wrong. The world outside her studio was changing. Lines of unemployed men, families searching for work, migrants wandering roads without knowing where to sleep. While others looked away, Dorothea Lange picked up her camera and walked toward them. She didn't travel with assistants. She didn't have lighting crews. She didn't carry heavy equipment. Just one camera, one lens, one observer, and she walked alone into the hardest moments of American life. When the Great Depression struck, millions of people lost jobs, homes, stability. Migrant workers lived in tents. Families traveled in broken cars. Children starved along rural roads. The government needed someone to document the crisis honestly, not for propaganda, not for newspapers, but to understand the truth and find a way to respond. Dorothea Lange became that witness. She traveled through California's farmlands, through dusty highways, through camps made of rags and scrap wood. She didn't pose her subjects. She didn't stage anything. She simply approached, spoke gently, listened, and waited for the moment when real emotion rose to the surface. Her photographs became windows into suffering that America had never dared to look at directly. Then came the image that changed history. In 1936, Lange stopped at a small camp in Nipomo, California, where she met a 32-year-old mother with 7 children, staring into the distance with a mixture of exhaustion and dignity. Lange took 6 photographs. One of them, later titled Migrant Mother, became the most iconic image of the Great Depression. The woman's face carried all of America's pain. Her eyes held fear and endurance in equal measure. Her children hid their faces, as if the world had taken too much from them already. When the photograph was published, the public reaction was immediate and explosive. And within 48 hours, the U.S. government sent 20,000 pounds of food to starving workers in that region. A single photograph fed a town. A single woman moved a nation. Dorothea Lange continued her work for decades. She documented Japanese-American families during World War II internment. Images of sorrow, confusion, and quiet resilience. She photographed rural poverty, urban migration, and environmental devastation. Her work didn't accuse, it revealed, it didn't shout, it illuminated. Lang proved something profound. When a society refuses to see its people, one camera in the hands of one truthful observer can restore its vision. By the time she died in 1965, Dorothea Lange had created one of the most powerful visual archives in American history. She didn't lead movements. She didn't create laws. She didn't found institutions. But her photographs shaped all of them. She made suffering visible. She made dignity undeniable. She made humanity impossible to ignore. And she did it alone, one shutter click at a time. In the next part of our documentary, we turn to another solitary force, a man whose breakthrough saved millions from hunger worldwide and redefined agricultural science. His name was Norman Borlaug, and his discoveries earned him the title, "The Man Who Saved a Billion Lives." Some heroes save nations, some save forests, some save ideas, but very few save humanity itself. Among all the solitary heroes in American history, one man changed the fate of the entire planet, without crowds, without applause, and without most people ever learning his name. His name was Norman Borlaug, and his life's work is the closest thing the modern world has to a miracle performed by science. The story begins in rural Iowa, where Borlaug grew up on a small farm, learning the rhythms of soil, seasons, and crops. He watched fields suffer through droughts. He saw families struggle through bad harvests. He understood hunger not as an abstract danger, but as a real presence, cold, silent, relentless. Years later, after earning a degree in plant pathology, Borlaug made a decision that would define his destiny. He would devote his life to ending famine, not reducing it, not studying it, ending it. It was an ambition so enormous that almost no one believed it was possible. But Borlaug wasn't looking for permission. He was looking for solutions. In the 1940s, Borlaug moved to Mexico, where wheat crops were failing catastrophically. Rust diseases destroyed fields, yields plummeted, farmers were trapped in a cycle of poverty. Few scientists wanted to work there. The conditions were harsh, the funding weak, the problem overwhelming. But Borlaug stayed. For years he worked alone in the fields, testing thousands of wheat varieties, planting by hand, crossbreeding, measuring, discarding, trying again day after day. Heat, dust, drought, disease, nothing stopped him. He created what he called shuttle breeding, growing crops in two radically different climates each year to force rapid evolution and resilience. The scientific community said it wouldn't work. It worked. By the late 1950s, Borlaug had developed a series of wheat strains that were high-yield, disease-resistant, drought-tolerant, stable in multiple climates, strong enough to withstand storms. Mexico's wheat production skyrocketed. From grain importer, the country became self-sufficient. But Borlaug knew the true challenge was still ahead. In the 1960s, two nations were facing catastrophic famine, India and Pakistan. The crisis was so severe that experts predicted hundreds of millions of deaths. Borlaug moved there immediately, sleeping in fields, loading seeds onto trucks himself, dodging political conflicts, convincing skeptical officials that his wheat could save entire populations. The first harvest was stunning. The second was historic. Within a few years, wheat yields doubled, then tripled. Shipyards that had been unloading emergency food aid now loaded grain for export. The world called it the Green Revolution. But Borlaug called it something simpler: the proof that hunger can be defeated. And here is the number that the world still struggles to comprehend. His agricultural breakthroughs are estimated to have saved over 1 billion lives, more than any doctor, any general, any political leader in modern history. And he did it not with speeches, not with armies, not with influence, but with seeds, with science, with the stubborn belief that hunger was a problem, not a destiny. In 1970, Norman Borlaug received the Nobel Peace Prize, one of the few scientists in history honored for saving lives on a planetary scale. But even then, he remained humble to the core. He avoided fame, he rejected comfort. He spent his later years traveling to poor regions to teach farmers how to feed themselves. He lived simply, worked tirelessly, and stayed focused on the mission until the very end of his life. Norman Borlaug proved something extraordinary. One person, armed with knowledge and compassion, can prevent suffering on a scale once considered unimaginable. He didn't command a nation. He didn't lead a movement. He didn't stand on a stage. He stood in the dirt, in the sun, in fields where the future of millions depended on the decisions he made alone. And he chose to fight for them. This documentary began with a simple idea. America's greatest heroes are often the ones who worked alone. Jonas Salk, Rachel Carson, John Muir, Nikola Tesla, Amelia Earhart, George Washington Carver, Grace Hopper, Dorothea Lange, Norman Borlaug. Different eras, different struggles, different callings. But one truth unites them all. They refused to wait for the world to change. They changed it themselves. Silent laboratories, dark rooms, forests, fields, cockpits, deserts, worn notebooks, cameras, computers, seeds. These were their battlefields. And because they fought on them, the world we live in today is safer, cleaner, fairer, healthier, and filled with possibilities they created for us. The lesson of these unknown heroes is clear. You don't need a crowd to make history. You only need courage and the refusal to stand still when the world needs you to move.